Hello and welcome to Introduction to Wildlife Tracking. My name is Bob Metcalfe, and I have been fascinated by local wildlife for as long as I can remember. On winter evenings, my father used to tell me stories about all the wild animals prowling in the woods outside my bedroom window, and I spent many a night looking out that window. Didn't see much, but it just amazed me that animals could live outside on their own, find their own food, shelter, water, not freeze to death. Even at a young age, that really made a big impression on me. The first time I saw an animal trail, or at least the first time I remember seeing an animal trail, I was probably about 10 years old. I was exploring the woods in back of my elementary school, and the rule was I could explore in the woods after school as long as I was home by supper time. So coming out of the woods on a winter evening, sun setting, snow on the ground, I saw this beautiful trail running up the hill through the pine trees. And it just amazed me. I looked at it for a long time. The sun was setting down behind the hill, and as I think back now, it was most likely a red fox trail that I was looking at. But then, at 10 years old, it was a mountain lion or it was a black bear. I wasn't sure which. But whatever it was great. I wanted to follow that trail. Then I remembered the rule. Tough decision. But when I did remember that that was the night my mother was making her famous meatloaf, that tipped the scales and I went home. But before I did, I stood on that trail and looked up the hill and realized that I was on one end of the trail and there was a wild animal on the other end. That trail was a direct connection between me and one of the animals that had fascinated me so much. So that's my start for wildlife tracking. I wanted to know everything I could know and learn everything I could learn. When you're on the trail of a wild animal, you really get to see its whole life. You see where it goes, where it eats, where it sleeps, what interactions it has with other plants and animals. The story is endless. And to read the story, first you need to be able to read the alphabet of tracks and sign. So that's what this class is about. So let's get right into it. You may or may not recognize some of these tracks right now, but I think by the end of the presentation you will know what these tracks are. The first thing in trying to find animal tracks is to try to find where animals are. And it really can be just about anywhere, but starting near a body of water is always a good idea, along the edge of a stream, a pond, a lake. But keep your eyes open because animal tracks can be anywhere, just like these raccoon tracks running down an old railroad track. When we see a track, one of the first things to think about, besides shape, is how many toes can you see in the track? That's going to help us get in the right family of animals to try to identify. So the image here is something probably everybody recognizes. This is an image of a deer track, and heart-shaped track with a pointed end points in the direction of travel. But deer tracks, like all tracks, can be variable. The animals have flexible feet. The substrates change between mud and sand and snow and ice, all kinds of conditions. So tracks can really look differently one to the next, which kind of brings up the first guideline of tracking, and that is to try not to make a decision too quickly based on one track. Look around and see as many as you can. We call a deer a two-toed animal because two toes show in the track. It's kind of strange to think about hooves as toes, but they actually are. Hooves are modified toenails. So here's a two-toed animal, but you might see three toes sometimes. Maybe another deer foot stepped on the same area. Maybe the deer's rear foot stepped on top of the front foot. You might only see one toe on some animals if the substrate is hard in one place and soft in another. So again, back to that guideline of always look at as many tracks as you can before you make a decision. And be willing to give up the decision too. That's really important. Don't get fixed on something. If you are convinced something is one thing and you find out, you see evidence that suggests it's something else, let go of the first assumption and move on. So deer, certainly one of the animals we're going to see tracks and trail of in the New England woods. One of the more beautiful animals we have out here. Here's a deer track in snow, and we're taking a measurement here. Measuring can help a lot in tracking. It's not the last word. A lot of measurements overlap sometimes, but there are times when that piece of information can help you be sure of what you're looking at. The track looks nice and simple, doesn't it? It's just two hooves, nice smooth shape. But take a look at the foot that made that track. It's really pretty complex. There's hard areas and soft areas on the bottom of a deer's foot. So in hard conditions, sometimes you'll only see the outline of a deer track, or maybe just the tip of a deer track. There's also a couple of vestigial toes that you can see further up on this animal's foot, and those will register in soft substrate. They look like two tiny dots behind the track. Here's measurements again. Besides track length and width, which can help us in identification, stride, which is really the step length of the animal, stride can help, and trail width, the outside of one track to the outside of the opposite track, like the outside of the left to the outside of the right. That can help in identification. Besides tracks and trails, sign is something that we're always looking for when we're out tracking. This is pretty common sign in New England. This is an antler rub. It was done by a male deer, a buck, during mating season. And he's rubbed the base of his antlers against this tree and scraped the bark off, and at the same time depositing some scent onto the tree. A lot of information about this animal that other deer can get, does and bucks. So this is sort of like the buck's Facebook page, if you will. Scat falls in the category of animal sign. It can be variable too, like everything in tracking. On this image, there are 7 little piles of scat. 6 out of the 7 are deer scat. Deer scat is flat or dimpled on one end and a little pointed on the other. And maybe if you look carefully, you'll be able to tell which little piles of scat here is not white-tailed deer. And if you guess the top center, you're absolutely right. That's cottontail scat, more like a ball that's flattened a little bit. We get into what sometimes looks like 3-toed tracks, then we're probably looking at birds. I say three-toed tracks, but you can actually see there is a 4th toe that's heads straight backwards or straight down in this image. This is, from the size of it, a wild turkey track. And ground birds have this little tiny toe that sticks out the back, where a bird that has to hold onto branches has a longer toe in the back. Here is a wild turkey. Pretty fancy guy. Here's a turkey trail. At first it looks like a straight line, but if you look carefully, you'll see it is a right, left, right, left, right. It's an alternate walk. This is a 2-legged animal, so walks pretty much like we do. I'm not sure what this turkey was doing, but it would be interesting to speculate how this got made. Turkey scat, like all bird scat, usually has the white uric acid that was expelled with the scat. So that's a good distinguisher between bird scat and mammal scat. Here's some more bird sign, these big holes in the tree here. From the size of the holes and from the rectangular shape, this is sign made by pileated woodpecker. And what they are after is insects that are inside the tree. Here's a woodpecker in action here. Banging your head on a tree seems like a tough way to get your lunch. Look at those wood chips fly. Lots of owls in the woods too, and this is a barred owl. And one kind of owl sign is this stuff that almost looks like scat. These little tight bundles of fur. This is an owl pellet. This is material that the owl coughed up that it couldn't digest, and it is made up of fur and bones. If we break up one of these pellets, you often find tiny rodent bones intact pretty much, not very often broken. So in a scat, you would expect the bones to be crushed by teeth. But in an owl pellet, they're usually intact, and sometimes the whole animal is in one pellet. That's why some people call owl pellets mouse kits. You can rebuild the mouse. Here's a four-toed track. It's facing up toward the top of the screen. When we see four toes, we're in either the dog or the cat family. And four toes with claws showing is probably a dog track. Cats usually keep their claws retracted when they walk. Not always. If they're climbing a steep hill or if they're trying to get traction in a loose substrate, you may see claws, but most of the time, cat tracks will not show the claws. So I'm going to show a little sketch in a minute here, but before I go off this image, I'd like you to notice a few things about it. One thing is there's a bump right in the middle of it, right in the center. Looks like a little hill. And that hill is actually the intersection of an X shape. The space between the toes, not the toes themselves, makes sort of an X. These are both canine characteristics that tell you that you're in the dog family. But is it a domestic dog? Is it a fox? Is it a coyote? Another thing to notice about this track is how oval shaped it is. It's not really round, it's more oval. And right on the top of it, there's two little claw marks that are very close together. The two front toe claws are almost touching each other. All these are characteristics of a coyote track, plus the size, measuring a little over 3 inches long. So if we look at these simplified track drawings, down the bottom right, you can see the coyote track like an oval shape. Domestic dog is in the middle. It's more often to be a rounder track, and the toes, outer toes, are usually spread out rather than facing forward. And the nails are usually very blunt and heavy. On the bottom is a track of a red fox, and I'll show you that track and the foot that made it in a minute. But let's just take a quick look at the cat tracks while we're looking at this picture. Top left is a bobcat, and top right is the size of a house cat. It's kind of small house cat. They can be a little bigger than that. But the thing to notice about the cat track, besides the missing claws, is that they're not symmetric. Look at the dog tracks, how those two front toes are pretty much parallel and on center line with the track. But on a cat track, the toes are shifted around a little bit. There's a leading toe. So another characteristic to distinguish cat from dog. Here's the foot that made that red fox track, very heavily furred, so red fox tracks are often kind of fuzzy looking in the snow and mud. And if you look carefully, on the heel pad, you'll see a bar that goes across. That bar is a good indication of a red fox track. But tracks can be confusing, especially domestic dog. There's all size domestic dogs and all kinds of feet. So luckily for us, the trail pattern, how the animal moves, how it places one foot relative to the other, is going to help us distinguish wild canid from domestic dog. Here's a coyote trail. Look how nice and straight it is. And every one of those marks on the ground is actually the impression of 2 feet. The front foot comes out of the impression, and the rear foot steps right back into the same impression. This is a very energy efficient gait for the animal to move. Domestic dogs don't need to be very efficient. They have plenty of energy. So this is a good distinction between wild canid and domestic dog. Here's our eastern coyote. Actually, a pretty complex mix of western coyote and eastern wolf and a little domestic dog and and a lot of combination of critters to create this magnificent animal. If you look on this image, going from top to bottom, right in the center, up and down, is coyote trail. So that would be a front foot, rear foot in each one of those holes. And by the way, if there were 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 coyotes traveling together, there's times when they step in the exact same footprints as the coyote in front of them. So you could have a few animals in one trail and maybe not realize it until they split up. So that's the coyote. Look at the spacing on the coyote trail, and then look at the trail diagonal, left to right. That is red fox, still doing that very accurate register of the rear foot in the front foot hole, but look how much smaller it is. So measurements are going to help here. This is one of those times when measurements are going to help a lot, is that step length for coyote is almost always going to be different from red fox. The step length is a function of speed, so a red fox moving really fast might have the same step length as a coyote moving more slowly. But most of the time, they fall into a natural gait that is most energy efficient, and that's when we can measure about roughly, I usually find about 17 inches for red fox step length, stride, and about 21 for coyote. Here's a red fox. And there's a red fox track. Can you see the impression that that bar made from the heel pad going across on the bottom part of the track? So that's really distinctive to red fox. This rodent family has a whole nother way of moving through the forest. This is gray squirrel. Of course, everybody knows this guy. Gray squirrels have 4 toes on the front feet and 5 toes on the rear. So when you look at this image and think about that, it looks like there's something wrong here. It looks like the front feet are in back of the back feet. And that's exactly what the trail of a squirrel looks like. What happens is those front feet land first, and before the rear feet have a chance to hit the ground, the squirrel is traveling forward through the air, and so the feet land ahead of where the front feet registered. So squirrel trail is going to have front feet in back and back feet in front. And this is what it looks like heading toward that tree. We also have red squirrel around here, a little bit more of a forest animal than suburban, but there's a lot of overlap. And red squirrel has that same pattern as gray squirrel does. Again, somewhere where measurements can often help. Trail width of these animals is quite a bit different. Gray squirrel is roughly in the 4 to 5 inch range. Red squirrel would be more in the 3 to 4 inch range. So there is some overlap, and those are rounded off numbers, but if you look in a field guide, you can get more accurate numbers. So other members of the rodent family also walk this way: chipmunk and mouse. A mouse trail would be much narrower with a trail width of about 1.5 inches. Another animal that moves similar to the way, or shows trail similar to the way a squirrel does, is eastern cottontail. Here's the trail of a cottontail. The 2 feet at the bottom right are front feet, and then just above that is rear feet. So the animal's traveling from bottom to top in the image. Front feet are landing first, and then rear feet are landing in front. But notice the placement of the front feet. One is in front of the other. That's usually different from, let's go back to gray squirrel, the gray squirrel where the front feet are side by side. Beaver, another member of the rodent family. Beaver tracks are kind of hard to find because they usually get wiped out by the beaver's tail or by a tree that it might be dragging. But beavers have 5 toes on the rear. 5 feet would be kind of strange. They have 5 toes on the rear. And here's a beaver track. You can see the webbing between the toes. But beaver tracks, in my experience, often show up as 3 toes. For some reason, 3 toes usually register more strongly than the other 2. So if you see a 3-toed track and you're thinking bird, take a closer look and see if there's a few more marks for those extra toes. Beaver sign is probably the most easy to see just driving by in your car. Beavers use wood for a lot of purposes, for building and for food. And sometimes it almost looks like artwork. I think this might have been a beaver attempt at a self-portrait. Beaver lodges, constructed out of sticks with a chamber inside where the beavers live. They often seem to be, I'm sure they're built for completely practical reasons in a certain place, but so often it looks like they picked the view. So many pictures I've taken of beaver lodges have prime real estate. Smaller than a beaver, muskrat. It looks very similar swimming in the water, but it has a blade-like tail, almost like a knife blade, and it is much smaller. If you were trying to tell whether a beaver was swimming or a muskrat was swimming, at a distance, it's kind of tough, but look for the tail. That tail on a muskrat will be wiggling like a snake behind the muskrat. It looks like a snake is chasing the muskrat across the water. Muskrats also build lodges, but they build them out of grasses and aquatic plants, not usually sticks. So many more animal tracks we could go through, and I hope you stick with this and keep learning more and more. So much to see, like these hand-like prints of a raccoon in mud. The sliding trail of an otter in snow, pretty exciting to see. And once you get better at finding track and sign, your chances of running into the otter himself are always improving. So that's when to remember that we need to be respectful of the wildlife when we're out, and always try to have the least impact that we can on their daily lives. So there'll be plenty of time for questions when we meet outside. But for now, I'd like to share a few concepts and methods that have helped me with tracking over the years. And what better place to do that than on the banks of a river on a beautiful summer morning. So let's go to the Artichoke River and continue. I'd like to focus on some of the things that you can do without being in a tracking class. When you can't come to a tracking class, when you're off by yourself or with your friends, I'd like to share some activities and methods that have helped me over the years to learn on my own. To learn on your own, I think one of the really important things you want to do is find a good field guide to work out of. I'm still using the one that I started with 30-something years ago. It's Tracking in the Art of Seeing by Paul Resendiz. Really good stuff about local wildlife, tracks and sign, good information. And as you can see, my book is full of notes here, all kinds of scribbles and things about things I've seen along the way. What is actually a better way to do it, I think, is to have a journal. Have some kind of a journal with you that you can write down your observations. Have location, date, and time is important when you look back later at this stuff. Also, I find it's really good to write down questions that come up. There'll be lots of questions as you look at things that you're not sure exactly what it is, or some behavior you haven't seen before in wildlife. Write the questions down, because it can be really hard to remember them later. That way, when you get home and you have the time, you can do some research and find out about that. So, good field guide. Another thing I carry is something produced by David Brown. He's in central Massachusetts. Excellent tracker. He has some really good books out, but he makes these track cards that are life size of each animal foot. And it can be a big help sometimes just to drop this down next to a track when you see one. Kind of give you an idea of the drawings. And let's see, what else? A book I don't carry with me, but I would recommend from a behavioral standpoint. Animal behavior is understanding animal behavior is certainly a big part of tracking. And this book by Mark Elbrock and Kurt Reinhardt, Behavior, North American Mammals, really good stuff. A little heavy to carry around, so this is a stay-at-home book for me. Okay, so to start off, especially if you're just starting, but I guess at any point really, what helped me a lot was to pick one animal. And not just any animal at random, but an animal maybe that you've really been interested in, that you've wondered about, maybe an animal that you've had a lot of encounters with, and an animal that's close by. So you can go to some of the places where that animal is and look for tracks and sign and maybe the animal itself. So once you pick your animal, you can do some research on behavior. What type of habitat are you likely to find that animal in? What time of day is it going to be active? Learn its tracks and sign, draw some tracks, learn some of the sign, and try to find an area locally where you can find that animal track and sign. So when I say focus on one animal, I don't mean to the exclusion of everything else, of all the other animals, but I believe that the trail of your animal will connect you to everything else in nature. It will bring you to places where other animals have been, so now you've got a new one to research. It'll show you plants you haven't seen before that it's eating. Go look those up. That animal will be your guide, your teacher. And that's something that's really worked well for me. It's also kind of a motivation. If it's an animal you're really interested in and really care about, that's what's going to get you out of bed when it's still dark out. So you're at the site at sunrise and keep you out maybe a little longer when the rain starts because you want to follow the trail. So I think of tracking or working with tracks and sign as a way to learn about wildlife. That's why I do it. And I sort of think of it in 3 steps. First is discovery. You have to find the tracks of the sign. And that requires a little research. Where are the animals likely to be? You can also just stumble on tracks and sign. That's going to happen all the time as you get more familiar with it. And a big part of the discovery process, a huge part, is being aware. And I'm going to come back to that later because we're going to do a few activities that I think help bring us into a state where we're present and we're really paying attention to what's around us. So awareness is a big part of discovery. The second step in the process is identification. And I guess that's what probably most people think about when they think about working with tracks and sign. That's where your field guide is going to come in really handy. Animal tracks can be really difficult. They don't usually look like the nice picture in the book. There's a lot of variability. The substrate can be muddy or sandy or dry or wet or snow or sleet, and the way the animal is moving. Animals' feet are very flexible. So birders have, I think, what they call field marks. It's certain characteristics on a bird that help with a positive identification. So we can kind of do field marks in tracking. So there's some features that you will not always, but almost always see in a track. And I kind of call those field marks, even though the track might look differently. And just as an example, got some rubber animal feet. Doesn't everybody carry animal feet in their pocket here? So let's see if I can hold this steady enough to show you. This is a replica of a raccoon foot. Raccoons have 5 toes in the front and rear. Very flexible toes. They can spread them really widely. They can pull them back and extend them. Sometimes raccoon tracks have skinny little toes. Sometimes they have more shortened bulbous toes, just by how the animal moves its foot. But if you look at the side of a raccoon track, how is that? Is that okay? You can see that the toes are on a higher plane than the palm pad, than this part of the track. So as the toes come back, there's a place where all of a sudden the track drops deeper. And the rest of the track is deeper than the toes are. And what that does is it makes a C shape right here that is almost like a cliff. If you walked back in the toes, you'd fall off the cliff into the palm pad. So that is what I would call a field mark on a raccoon track. Most of the time you're going to see that, and it's very characteristic. Just as another example, most everybody knows what a deer track looks like, this nice heart shape. But again, even hooves are flexible. These toes can spread really widely. Sometimes you'll only see the tips of the toes. The animal's weight is on the front of the foot. Sometimes they'll sink so deeply that 2 extra toes will show. So there's a lot of variability. What I would maybe consider a field mark on a deer track is the space between the hooves. Even though it can change, there's always a ridge down the middle. So that's just one more characteristic. So we've kind of gone through 2 steps of the process, the discovery and the identification. And next comes the most fun part, the interpretation. So we see that this animal is here, but that's when all the questions start. Why is it here? What was it doing? Where did it come from? Where is it going? How is that animal's presence affecting all the rest of the environment around it? Other animals, what plants is it eating? What kind of predators might be after it? So this is when your animal becomes the teacher and shows you who would know the forest better than the deer and the fox and the fisher. So that's kind of the 3 steps of tracking in my mind, and it helps me to remember those and kind of do the process in the right order. So getting down to tracks and sign, animal sign is everywhere. It's everywhere. I picked this spot to start because I see some stuff that's interesting right off the bat. One thing we have over here, the tops of logs are really good places to look for animal sign. Scat, different animals like to walk on logs, and scat is often on top of a log. It's also on top of a log too, because scat is often a communication mode. The animal wants other animals to see the scat. It's saying something with that message. The other thing that logs are good for is they're good feeding posts. And over here we have some nuts that are chewed down in a little groove here. A bunch of different stuff. I probably should put my glasses on so I know what it is. These are hickory nuts. This would come from a fairly mature tree, not a little sapling. And we don't really see in the immediate area any hickory trees. So this is a disturbance. In tracking, we're looking for disturbances. A hickory nut is not supposed to be in a log by the river. It's supposed to be under a hickory tree. So an animal has moved it here, and here you can see the chewing. And here's another hickory nut. This looks a lot newer, fresher, but it's chewed differently. And luckily for us, different animals open up nuts in different ways. This is kind of characteristic of a red squirrel, opening from both sides toward that center rib. And they often go a lot further than that, so that the center rib is almost like a disc that's left. Gray squirrel has larger teeth and jaws and muscles. It can break the nuts up in a lot smaller fragments than red squirrels normally do. So it's a function of the strength of the animal's mandibles, but also how big is its face? How big a hole does it have to make so that it can get in and get the meat? It's not going to do any more work than it has to. And over the years, I've collected some different nuts that I've actually seen the animal open. I'll just show you a few of them here. Every time I do this, I think this is the time I'm going to dump it all on the forest floor. Here's red squirrel, typical red squirrel opening. And here's more like the fragments of the gray squirrel like we just talked about. Let's see, do I have some good mouse stuff? Let's see, mouse. I like to find one that has multiple small holes in it, because that's more of a mouse nut would sometimes have like 4 holes on a side. I don't think I have one here to show you. Because they have the small little face, they can get right in there and get the meat without having to make a great big hole. And so quite a bit of difference. Is this the one I want here? Let's see. Oh yeah, okay. Here's looks like some mouse work. Little tiny holes. And I'll show you one more. It's usually everybody's favorite. Can you see how smooth a cut that's made all the way around the top of this acorn? This time it's not a hickory nut. It's like a bevel. It almost looks like someone did it with a can opener. This is the work of flying squirrel. They make this really clean, nice, smooth opening. And we actually have a lot of flying squirrels around here. We just don't get to see them because they're nocturnal and pretty shy. So we can get a pretty good idea what kind of squirrels are around here just by the nuts that we find. Now, everything in tracking is not so much a rule, it's more like a guideline. So if I found one nut that was opened a certain way, I might have an idea what it was, but I couldn't be sure. I need to find a whole bunch of them that all look the same in the same area, and then that's going to be more information that really is the kind of squirrel that I think it is. And all the tracking stuff is like that. It's like we're weighing the evidence. It's rarely that one thing is the answer. It's like if you picture a balance scale. We put a little bit of evidence on this side for this animal, and oops, well, it kind of looks a little like that, and eventually we get enough on one side that we can make a determination whether we're identifying a track or sign or anything. We've also got, if you take a look right here, some old beaver chew on this blueberry. After trees or shrubs are cut like this, often they kind of explode in growth in this stuff that's called coppice. And this is really tender, really good eating stuff. So you would normally expect, if the beavers were still around, that they would come back and get this stuff too. It looks delicious. But it doesn't look like it right here, but that's not the whole story. We need to really look around. We've got some more old beaver chew over there. And here is an alder that got hit pretty good by the beavers at some point. You can see the 45-degree angle cut, the tooth marks there. And this coppice, this alder coppice, is being eaten. Can you see that its leaves are chopped off here? But it doesn't look like that nice, clean beaver cut. This looks more like deer browse. Deer don't have top teeth in the front of their mouth. So what they do is they pinch vegetation between their palate and lower teeth and break it off really roughly so it'll have this rough look to it. So it looks like the deer have been back at this alder after the beaver cut it and had this coppice growing. Okay, here we go. So far we haven't seen any fresh beaver sign. We know that there were beaver here, but there's some stuff down here that looks pretty pretty fresh. These are some beaver chew sticks. If you can see the end there, you can see the teeth marks if I hold it at the right angle maybe. And this would have been feeding. Beaver use wood for a lot of things. It's a building material for dams and lodges. It's also food. The green growing layer right under the bark, the cambium layer, is beaver food, one of the beaver foods. So this looks like a little snack was going on here. Maybe a work break, a lunch break and a snack on the shore here. What else have we've also got? Can you see that there are grasses, sedges or grasses that are, here's one right here. That are broken off. They're floating all around here. I don't see any sedges growing here. So this stuff is probably drifted in. There's some out there, drifted in from somewhere else. Looks like the current's going that way. This is an indication that there's muskrat around too. Muskrat will eat grasses and sedges, but they also, especially this time of year, are making beddings in their burrows, and they'll collect fresh bedding material almost every day. Go out on land and grab mouthfuls of, or along the water's edge, grab mouthfuls of this stuff and bring it back into their burrows. They make lodges just like beaver, only they make them not out of wood, but out of aquatic plants and grasses, cattail, things like that. But on a body of water like this, which is probably too deep to start a lodge, they would likely have bank burrows. So they would be digging into the bank and then up under the upland area, and that's where they would live, in these bank burrows under the shoreline. So sign is everywhere, you know, and the more you look, the more you see. Staying in one place can really be good sometimes, you know, because you see things after a few minutes that you didn't see at first, and an hour later you see a little more that you didn't see. So just have to keep our eyes open, and that's where the awareness part of this comes in. I'd like to move into the upland a little bit here. You set aside this special day to be out in the woods, and you get here, and what happens to me a lot of times is I'm here but I'm not. I'm thinking about what I should have done yesterday and what I need to do tomorrow, and there's a voice racing in my mind about all kinds of stuff. I need to get rid of that. I need to be right here, right now, because that's where the lesson is. That's what nature wants to teach us. So there's a few things that I do that kind of help me do that. One is, I guess I don't know a lot about meditation, but if you do, this is a good way to start. You know, whatever works for you in your meditation. Take a deep breath. Pay attention to your breathing. Relax your muscles. And I like to do what I call a slow walk. I take one step, and I still have my weight on both feet. It's just one step, so I'm comfortable. I can stay here for a few seconds. And I'm going to stay here until I notice 2 or 3 things. I'm going to look around. Okay, you don't have to label things, you don't have to identify it. I'm going to a little bit so you know what I'm looking at, but got a red maple sapling here, we've got a pine cone, a little Canada Mayflower. Okay, maybe I'll take another step. What do I see? What do I hear? Any sounds? What I'm trying to do is fill my mind so full of sensory input that there's no room to think. My whole mind is trying to get to a point where I'm paying attention to what I see, what I hear, what I smell. Are there scents in the air? Take another step. Relax and look. This is a great exercise to do before you start on your tracking adventure. The other thing that is kind of good to think of at this point. I read a book years ago, I believe it was written by John Young, and he talked about something called bubbles, bubble concepts. I'm pretty sure that's what he called it. It goes like this. We have different kinds of bubbles that surround us. Some of them are bubbles of perception. In other words, if I look around, how far can I see? In all directions, up and down. The limits to how far I see is the edge of my bubble of visual perception. And then how about hearing? Can I hear sounds? How far away? I don't mean like really loud sounds that you could hear for miles. I'm talking about sounds like a twig snapping under a deer's foot, or the rustle of a squirrel in the leaves. Those kinds of sounds. And scents. How about smells? As a tracker, you'll come to be able to identify wildlife just by the scent. When you're in an area, you'll know that there's beaver there, that there's fox there, that there's deer there. You'll know by scent. The other kind of bubbles are bubbles of disturbance. How far can my noise be heard? How far does my bubble extend? Am I making a lot of noise, snapping sticks, stomping through the forest? And visually, am I moving really fast, which makes my visual bubble really big? I can be seen from far off by moving too fast. The idea is to make your bubbles of disturbance smaller than your bubbles of what your senses can determine. And that's the way we're going to get to see wildlife. We need to be able to hear them farther away than they can hear us. Quiet, move slowly. And another reason to do it is it's just the right thing to do. It's respectful of the animals. We're in their world. Being quiet is being respectful. So that exercise will kind of get you started and to slow down. I usually do it for maybe 10 minutes. Sometimes it's really hard for me to do it. I don't know if that will be like that with everybody, but I take a step and I don't want to stay here, I want to go. Those are the times I need it the most, that I really need to slow down, because I'm just going to miss stuff. And there's an activity that I usually do with little kids. And when I finally tried it on my own, I realized how powerful it really is. I've been doing it for a long time and just thinking of it as a little kid's game. But it's called deer ears. And the idea is that deer are really good at detecting sounds. And you've probably seen deer standing at the edge of a clearing, sniffing the air, looking around, moving those big ears, trying to find the different sounds. It turns out that the mechanism of hearing in deer really isn't that much better than our own. What they have, their big advantage, is those great big ears, those big cupped ears. So if we as humans form that deer ear like that, you want to push your fingers really tight together, no spaces, no air spaces. It's formed in a cup kind of shape. You stick it on the back of your head and push your ears forward. And when you do this, you're going to look just as silly as I do, but give it a try. It's really amazing how much it changes how far you can hear. And you can pick out direction too this way by moving around. You might, like I do, have one ear that's much better than the other. So I have to kind of calibrate my deer ears. I have to see something that's making a sound, maybe a red squirrel chattering at me. And I close my eyes and try to locate it. And when I open my eyes, I'll be off to the left by a little bit. So now that's my calibration if I'm really trying to pinpoint a sound. So, what do you say we go explore a little bit, see what we can find here in the forest? Well, we will be going off to explore in person when we get together in a few days. So, as I said, there'll be plenty of time for questions. We will be outdoors for about 3 hours. So depending on season and weather, I want to make sure everybody is comfortable. It's summertime, it's a good idea to wear long sleeve pants and shirt that protects against ticks and poison ivy a little bit. and bring a bottle of water and maybe some insect repellent. On the colder weather programs, make sure you have nice warm clothing and layers, and all the time, any time of year, good boots, because we will be off trail quite a bit. And as far as equipment, nothing is mandatory, but I think you'd get a little bit more out of the session if you bring a notebook, small notebook and pencil, and a tape measure. We will be doing some work with trail patterns probably. And I'll look forward to seeing everyone there.